Welcome to Focus on Liberia Prime Time. My name is Dennis John. We are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Once again, welcome to Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis John, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is FOL Primetime Sunday. My name is Dennis Jard, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In today's edition, our topic is for profit and for power, state policies, foreign direct investments, and economic exploitation in Liberia. And the period we're going to be looking at 1920 to 1960. My guest, Dr. Ibrahim Nyei, he's a political scientist and policy analyst. Dr. Nyei, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. Jai.
And by way of introduction, there's a little disclaimer. He is Dr. Ibrahim Nyei, but for the sake of the topic tonight or the lecture tonight, he prefers to be called IB for short. So IB, welcome to Focus on Liberia. I don't want the people to hear it and think I'm disrespecting what you've earned. Welcome, brother.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you.
All right. Ibrahim is a political scientist and policy analyst. He studied, he got his BA in 2009 in political science from AME University, Liberia. His master's in public policy and human development in the Netherlands. And of course, his PhD last year in politics and international studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. His primary research areas and expertise are political economy, governance and democratization, decentralization, local government, security sector reform, peace and security, civic engagement and advocacy, social research and policy analysis, monitoring and evaluation. Dr. Nyei, break that down for me. What is this all about?
Well, basically, that's just the areas of study. That's just basically what I focus on when I'm doing. The field of political science and economics are very broad fields, and so you can't just be into everything. So you have to focus on specific areas of research, and the ones you call are my areas of specific focus. And democratization, that's about how societies evolve into being democracies from various forms of regimes, various forms of government, how systems of democratic governance are developed. And political economy, just understanding various power structures and structures of economies of developing countries.
And you are joining us from London. You joined the London School of Business in 2009 as a researcher on the project, The Political Economy of African Development, and you look at ethnicity, nation, and history. How's that research project going?
Oh, well, that's pretty good. I'm just supporting a professor who is studying economic development in Africa from the European colonial era on the continent, and then the role of European concession companies. That's basically it. And actually, it was not 2009. I joined just 2 years ago, 2019.
2019. Yeah. Sorry about that. You also work for the Governance Commission of Liberia as a policy analyst on political and legal reforms.
Yeah.
That group still exists, but we don't hear much about it. How is it?
Well, the commission exists, and I think they've been doing some work on decentralization, and they've been supporting some constitutional reform exercises. And I think it's just about contacting the officers at the commission, and then they will just tell the public more about what they've been doing.
Yeah, please link us with them. We want to talk to them so they can tell us what they're doing. By the way, Ibrahim is also a blogger and a regular commentator on political and economic developments in Africa, with focus on Liberia. He's been on the BBC, Al Jazeera English, and now he's on Focus on Liberia. We are glad to have you. And I want to also mention that Ibrahim is a graduate of the great Monrovia College and Industrial Training School. And that's one thing we have in common. Fellow Monkey, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, Monkey. Thank you, fellow Monkey.
Again, our topic for today, we say for profits and for power. State policies, foreign direct investments, and economic exploitation in Liberia from the period 1920 to 1960. You're writing a paper about that. It's in the making. Briefly, tell me what is this? It's a big topic. Break it down for me in a few sentences.
Okay, this is just about looking at how various policies of the Liberian government facilitated foreign investment in Liberia, and how the foreign investors worked along with the Liberian government to support each other in their consolidation of their interests or the accumulation of their interests. The state's interest is to accumulate more power, to be able to govern, and more authority and resources to govern or perhaps deliver services. That's the main interest of the state. And then private companies, of course, their interest is mostly to accumulate profit, maximize wealth for their shareholders through the production of whatever commercial services they can or the extraction of resources. And so how the Liberian state and the foreign companies that interacted in this area that we're going to be talking about, how they interacted to support each other in accumulating on their various interests for the state in terms of political power and authority, and for the private companies in terms of the maximization of profit.
And key words there: foreign direct investment, foreign companies, and then because foreign direct investment in Liberia and how that has impacted our economy spans over years. Why this particular point in time?
Well, those were the heydays, the halcyon years of FDIs in Liberia. It was like a rain. They were glutting over the country, coming from all over, from the United States, from Europe. This small piece of land, 38,000 square miles or 43,000 square miles, they were just coming in from the 1800s, the late 1800s. And then by the time Firestone came in, from the 1920s up to 1945, you have tons of organizations, private companies coming in the country, wanting to invest in this small piece of land. And so much happened during that time. Economic exploitation, government increases authority and power, gain more land spaces to control, and then the companies made millions of dollars from this country. And so that period is very interesting to study. And there are so many other scholars that have studied this particular period. So what I'm doing is not completely new research in studying this period, but we all have just been drawing on various archival materials, company reports, government reports, and what other scholars have written about the various eras in Liberia's development to draw some conclusions that are very relevant for the period to come, like even the present. So our conclusions will support ongoing policies, ongoing academic work, and future development of the state, both in terms of political power, in terms of economic power.
And I want us to start to work our way backwards a little bit, because foreign direct investment, let's start from there. What is it? And how does it impact any economy?
Well, the world is a global village, and globalization, according to so many scholars, globalization has really peaked since the 1990s, and boundaries have been dismantled to significant degrees. And like in the European Union, you hardly find borders, particularly in the mainstream of the European Union, and even those that are in the Schengen countries. So foreign direct investment in this case, in the context of the global economy, is when a company from one country leaves and then invests in another country. So that is called foreign direct investment. So when you are calculating foreign investment in Liberia, you calculate all of the foreign companies that have invested in the Liberian economy. And so that's separate from the domestic investment. The domestic investment are what Liberians themselves invest in their own economy. So foreign direct investment is just a big terminology referring to foreign investments in the country. Metal Steel, in present-day Liberia, you have Metal Steel, you have Golden Veronium, and you have San Dabi that have just recently sold their plantation to another company. So, and then you still have Firestone. Those are all what you refer to as foreign direct investment.
And that is different from foreign aid.
Well, foreign aid is just donation. I mean, you're looking at another country or an organization, looking at your government or your country, donating money to you and saying, we want you to invest in agriculture with this money, we want you to invest in healthcare. That's foreign aid. So, in fact, over the last few years, what people like Paul Kagame and to his memories, blessed be his memory, John Magufuli, their argument has been now they want more foreign direct investment than foreign aid into their countries. Because what foreign direct investment does, it promotes more economic empowerment and it stimulates the domestic economy as well, because people are working to produce resources and materials. And then they create opportunities for more transaction, more job creation. And as more workers are paid, government is able to extract taxes from those workers on income tax. But foreign aid, no. Foreign aid is just, it's 100 million. You can go build 5 schools, and after that, that's it.
What attracts FDI to a country?
So many variables, actually, so many indicators. First of all, and the first and foremost thing is political stability.
Okay.
And that's the primary function of a government, is to protect lives and property, is to provide public safety. And so if a government can adequately provide peace and security or control public authority within its realm and ensure political stability, that's the number one condition for foreign investment. Obviously, there are secondary conditions. The secondary conditions normally are, for example, the largesse the government has to offer, tax credits or tax holidays, and perhaps low land rental and duty-free privileges. And so many people, these are the secondary conditions. And also government policy of what we had in the 1940s, open door policy, for you tell foreign companies, come here, we have all of these incentives for you. But even with all of these incentives, without political stability, you risk losing foreign investment. And also, before foreign companies come, they do what they call political risk analysis.
Okay.
And political risk analysis examine the conditions under which companies operate in a country. How safe is the investment in a given country? So risk analysis, you look at security of contract. If I'm bringing my company to your country and I sign a contract with you, how secure is that contract? What's the guarantee that this contract will be enforced? And so the proximate variables of assessing security of contract is the judiciary system. You want to see how effective is the judiciary system, and the judges are not corrupt, they are not prone to accepting bribes. And then you also have perhaps speedy mechanism for adjudicating cases. And then you have political security, and then you have regime security as well. So companies are assured that when they sign an agreement, if the next 2-3 days there's a military coup, if the agreement would not be, the entire investment would not be nationalized, or another government will not automatically change the terms of the agreement. So what they do this political risk analysis. So political risk analysis is just what are the risks if we enter this territory? Do we risk losing this investment as a result of political change, or as a result of corruption in the political system. Obviously, there are other things they do, like financial risk, and that financial risk is more internal to the company to know the risk to their finances if they are borrowing money to invest. So many factors companies examine to enter into a country. And if a country is politically corrupt, if the government, the politicians are very venal, they extract bribes, they risk losing foreign investment, because over the last 30 years, so many countries have strengthened their laws. For example, if a British company leaves from the UK and bribes Liberian officials to gain a contract, besides the Liberian government investigating that, the British government would prosecute that company, similarly to the United States. So they have what they call the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act.
Yeah.
The US government has that, the British government has that, and so many European countries have that, because they want to create the condition for their companies, their investors, and their citizens to do clean and legitimate businesses in foreign land.
What has been the trend for FDI in Liberia within the past, let's say, 20 to 30 years?
Well, we've climbed the hills, sloped down, gone up, sloped down, back and forth. Obviously, during the Civil War, there was a massive decline. No one wants to invest in a country that had no stability, like I said earlier. And when we returned to democratic rule in 2006, between 2006 to 2010 alone, we had so many companies coming to the country. That was when we signed the Meta Steel Mineral Development Agreement. We signed the China Union, the Putu Mountain. We signed the Sand Derby. We signed the Golden Varroa, and even other companies that went down resuscitated their investment. And so during that time, up to 2017, we were up the hill actually. Mm-hmm. But obviously, over the last 2 years, also last year, particularly because of the pandemic, companies are holding back. They have to wait. And the nature of our economy is mainly extraction. And so companies are not, manufacturing is not going on much. So those that are interested in extracting resources, we have to observe the climate and look at the productivity of the resources and the profitability associated with the resources they are extracting. So we don't have significant commercial oil. Mm-hmm. And so at the moment, oil prices are increasing on the global market, so there won't be any rush to Liberia. There will be rush to Nigeria. There will be rush to Angola. There will be rush to countries like Mozambique, because they have. What we have rubber, we have iron ore. Very recently, I heard Meta Steel is increasing their investment because there is a huge prospect that iron ore will increase in the next 1 or 2 years, and it's already on that. It's already on that trajectory.
And I know we'll go back to our main topic for discussion. I just want to soften the ground a little bit.
That's
whose role it is to look at it, because companies coming to invest in Liberia, they have their own interest, that's for profit. The Liberian government, for instance, who's representing the Liberian people, is looking out for its own benefit as well. What is it that we're supposed to look at? In other words, whose role it is to make sure that we all benefit mutually?
Well, first of all, it's the responsibility of the Liberian state to use its resources under the Constitution to the benefit of all Liberians. There is a chapter in the Constitution of Liberia, Chapter 2, the General Principles of National Policy. So that chapter lays out how national policy should be articulated, promoted, and implemented. It says in that particular chapter that the government shall ensure, the republic shall ensure that the natural resources, that Liberians will benefit in the production of its natural resources. So this means it's the responsibility of the government to do legitimate business with whether domestic or foreign actors to beneficiate the natural resources to the benefit of the Liberian people. And so that's a primary responsibility on the Liberian government. Who's going to check the government? Well, we have various institutions. We have an executive branch of government that implements. We have a legislative branch that checks the executive and checks the judiciary, and we also have the judiciary. They operate in a cycle, a triangular framework where they check on each other power. And so outside, we have the civil society. So they all should hold the government to account for all of its actions, whether in political governance, in economic management and governance.
Thank you. I think it was around 2012, there was a big spike in FDI coming to Liberia. Someone said that I should introduce you. I think they are late, but so introduce your guest. So let me put a little blur there. Dr. Ibrahim Nyei, he studied political science from AMEU, MS in public policy and human development. That's in the Netherlands. The name of the school there, I think that in Dutch, I can't call it.
Maastricht.
And he got his PhD in politics and international studies at SOAS. That's the School of Oriental and African Studies. That's in London. There he currently works, and that's where he's joining us from. So if you are just joining us, this is focused on Liberia. We are in discussion with Dr. Ibrahim Nyei. He's a political scientist and policy analyst. So let's go back to our topic for today, which is for profit and for power. State policies, foreign direct investment, and economic exploitation in Liberia, 1920 to 1960. Let's look at this period. What was going on at this time?
Well, significantly, I said earlier, the 1920s marked the transition to a more concessionary economy and a more exploitative economic system. And to the 1960s, that was around that time was the halcyon years of the Liberian economy, meaning the economy, the engine of the economy was very hard, to put it metaphorically. The economy was very busy. There was massive growth, and we had massive growth in this era, mainly from the 1950s to 1960. So many investment in all of the sectors of the economy, the traditional sectors. In the 1920s, we were with plantation agriculture, beginning with Firestone. In the 1940s, we had mineral investment, beginning with the LMC. In the 1950s, we had the forestry sector open. When the government passed the Forestry Act in 1953, so many investment came in timber, lumbering, and logging in the forestry sector. So that was the halcyon years of economic production in Liberia. But also, it was also moments of exploitation, because it was basically an economy based on extraction, not manufacturing, no intermediary production stage. It was just extract, take to the free port or whichever port, and then bring to the metropoles. The metropoles here are the big European capitals or the American cities where the production took place, and then return them back to our shores, to our same ports, and then we buy them as manufactured.
During this time, we have President Charles D.V. King from 1920 to 1930, President Edwin Barclay from 1930 to 1944, and we have the Pape, W.V.S. Tubman from 1944 to 1971. We're looking at to 1960. Yeah. To what extent, what was their role in the period that we're looking at to benefit or exploit Liberia?
Well, they drove this process. Let's go to Barclay. Let me take you back a bit to President Barclay.
Arthur.
Yeah, Arthur Barclay.
Okay.
When he started what he called the Barclay Plan in 1904, right, for the integration or the extension of the Liberian state to the hinterland of Liberia.
Right.
He also made it known that for the state to develop, because before 1904, the Liberian government relied on from one loan to another, foreign loan to another. And so the government was in terrible financial state. So his policy was, we cannot continue to rely on foreign loan. We have to now look into foreign direct investment as a model of economic growth. Yeah. But before him, I'm taking you further back to J.J. Roberts.
Okay.
In 1874, he came to, this is his second term after the unfortunate incident with President Edward J. Roy, when Roberts took over in his second presidential moment. He came to London in 1874 and signed several concession agreements. And some of the concessions involve public infrastructure, not just mineral extraction. Some involve building of train stations, train track for public transport, tramways, and motorways that the companies will put toll on. And so he signed these concession agreements, also signed mineral extraction agreements. And all of the companies that signed, they could not actually invest in the country because they didn't get the sufficient financing arrangements they needed from the London financiers to do the investment. But the contracts he signed, the concession agreements, the model and the terms of the agreement remain very valid, and successive Liberian governments up to the Firestone agreement used the model he signed in those concession agreements to sign future agreements. And I tell you for sure, that model is what the Liberian state is still operating on. And that model,
as of today,
up to today, they're still operating on that model with some adjustment. The recent adjustment have been introducing contemporary principles of community rights to land, like free, prior, and informed consent. But the economic model to incentivize the companies, giving them tax breaks, and assuring them that they have grounds to recruit labor. Well, we closed on the issue of forced labor in 1962, but all of the incentives that J.J. Roberts provided the companies in the 1874 concession contracts in London. You have tax holiday, you have duty-free privileges, and you'll be allowed to repatriate your profit. All of those principles are in modern-day concession agreements.
Why?
Well, maybe many governments think that if they don't give the companies these breaks, these massive incentives, the companies will look for other countries to invest in, and then they will have opportunities to generate rent and to extract taxes. So when Roberts introduced that, even though the companies did not go to the country because they could not raise the financing needed, for example, building train tracks, investing in mines at the time in the 1800s, they could not raise the money to do the investment. But the country continued to use the model. And several concession agreements actually were signed. So, except you have other questions, but I want to discuss the era before the 1920s.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, the concession agreements before the 1920s were mostly with trading companies. And those trading companies, they were not doing exploitation of minerals. Even though there was one mineral agreement signed with the Union Mining Company in 1869, but they also did not mine. What they did was to interact with the natives, and the natives that they artisanal mining at the time gave them some gold, and then they brought the gold out. They brought the gold to Europe or to the US, but they did not continue into mining. They transitioned into trading. So what most of them did was to sign contracts with the government to control certain portions of the country. For example, a particular company will sign that they are responsible for Maryland. And so if they are responsible, they have control over Maryland. All of the resources in Maryland, they will be the trading companies to extract the resources. How they did it, they were mostly involved with rubber and coffee. They didn't grow rubber, they didn't grow coffee. But rubber was in the bush, all of the bushes in most parts of the country. So the natives will go in the forest, extract the rubber, and then they will bring it to these companies, and then they weigh them, and then they buy from the natives. So when they sign the concession agreement, those that have control over certain areas, no other company was allowed to trade there. So that was the model of concession at the time.
Let's take it step by step. So I'm a trading company. I came to Liberia. I say I'm going to mine gold. Yeah. I go to Bokonjiri. The natives there are mining gold. They just mine the gold, give it to me, and then I go and trade it.
Yes,
I'm not involved. So you were only trading, and who on whose terms were they buying these things from the local farmers or?
Actually, they didn't do any significant mining. So let's focus on what they really did.
Okay.
The natives gathered rubber from the forest, palm products, and coffee. And so when coffee became very important, the settlers and the coastal counties began to grow their own coffee plantations. And so the Europeans bought it from them. But mainly the rubber, they will allow the natives to go in the forest and gather the rubber, bring the rubber to their trading stations, and they will weigh the rubber, and then they buy the rubber from the natives. But then some of them change the strategy. They will hire the natives, and so you go to town and collect at most, you go to the forest, collect at most 4 pounds of rubber a day. And so they will pay them around 15 to 30 cents a day for that collection, for whatever they collected. But then also, when you collected your own rubber, you brought the rubber to town, to the trading station, they buy that for you for around 6 cents a pound. But then when they bring it to Europe, it was anything between 70 to 80 cents a pound. That was in the late 1800s. So we have several companies that were in various parts of the country where the Liberian government signed concession agreements with them, and so they control those areas. We had the Union Mining Company, which transitioned and became the Liberia Development Company, headed by a British imperialist who came from Nigeria, Sir Harry Johnston, a British guy who worked in the colonial government in Nigeria.
Yeah.
So, and then we had the Liberia Rubber Company. So the interesting thing to transition from this gathering, while most of them were just gathering from the natives, so the Liberia Rubber Company tried to experiment plantation agriculture. So they started the first rubber plantation in the country in 1910. And this rubber plantation was in Mount Barkley. So they signed a contract with the Liberian government, and this contract was for 2,000 acres of land in Mount Barkley. And they started the experimental plantation using rubber harvested from the forest, mainly from the southeast and Grand Bassa County. And so they started this plantation, and they found out that Liberia had a very good rubber. And so when they started this plantation, 10 years down the line, the company went into liquidation in 1920. And so the rubber industry went down, but this company did not only extract rubber, the Liberian government gave them the contract to be like the forestry manager. They were managing the forest products of the country. And at the time, when you talk about forest products, you're talking about palm products. There were no plantations, they were just in the white forest. You're talking about rubber, you're talking about cassava, coffee, and so many other essentials. So many other produce they extracted. So the Liberian Rubber Company was responsible to manage all of the other companies that were producing in that area. So they taxed all of the native traders on behalf of the Liberian government. So they collected the forestry tax from them. If you are bringing a pound of rubber to town, you have to report it to the Liberian Rubber Company, and then you pay the tax on that. Then you sell to the trading company that also purchases it from you. Then the Liberian Rubber Company paid the Liberian government a percentage of the taxes collected. But when the company went into liquidation in 1920, it affected the Liberian economy. So also, another thing that affected the Liberian economy was World War I. Most of the entire economy before World War I was controlled by the Germans. 75% of the Liberian, all of the produce extracted from Liberia before World War I, 75% of that went to Germany. And the local stores, like we have today, foreign companies like mainly dominated by Indians or Lebanese merchants. At that time, we had mainly Germans. But when World War I broke out and America compelled the Liberian government to declare war on Germany, and then they seized the properties of the German traders in the country, and then the Germans left the country, the economy collapsed. It was an automatic collapse of the Liberian economy. It's like telling all of the foreign merchants in the country to close your stores in Watersa, close your stores in Douala. So the Liberian economy collapsed, and then by 1920, immediately after the war also, the Liberian Rubber Company was not functioning. The government finances were terrible. And then came Firestone in 1922.
Before that, so when America forced Liberia to close down those German companies and expel them, Did America not take over those companies or do something? They just left them?
They didn't significantly replace the German investments in the country, even though they brought Firestone. But the engine of the economy, the day-to-day transactions were based on produce from Europe, actually, manufactured from Europe. Yeah.
Right. Then let's go to Firestone.
So, again, Firestone was an American reaction. Firestone was an American reaction to a policy of the British government. Okay. So, before World War I and immediately after World War I, 75% of the global rubber trade was controlled by Britain. When I say controlled by Britain, meaning they were producing British colonies. We had Malaysia, we had Sri Lanka. At the time, they called Sri Lanka Ceylon, Malaysia Malay, and then several British colonies in Asia. So they were producing a huge portion of the global rubber. While Liberia and other West African countries they didn't have plantations, they had just forest extraction. Right. So what the British did, because the war economy was flooded with rubber, and their economy also relied on the production from their colonies around the world, the British Empire, and then the rubber price went down significantly. So early 1920s, they introduced what they call the Stevenson Plan. They established a committee to investigate why they dropped in the rubber price on the global market. And so this committee was headed by a British politician called Sir James Stevenson. So then the report was they should restrict the production of rubber. And so when they restrict the production of rubber, eventually demand will exceed supply, and then the prices will go up. But before that recommendation, there were more rubber on the world market than demanded. But then at that time also, while Britain produced up to 75% of the world rubber, America consumed about 75% of the world rubber. So British policy of restricting the rubber trade by reducing production so that prices could increase, and so the British companies would profit, and then the British government generate more revenue, affected the American economy. So then several American investors told the American government that they have a plan. They could find alternative strategy. And that alternative strategy was for America to grow its own rubber, find its own source of rubber controlled by America, instead of those controlled by the British government in the British colonies. And so Harvey Firestone sold his idea, and the American government accepted his idea. So he went to Philippines, and the first place he went in the early 1920s was the Philippines. He went to Mexico, and there were political situations in the Philippines that affected this. They were nearly at the point of signing the contract in Philippines, but there were unfavorable political situations which affected the investment. And so alternatively, he looked to Liberia. So went to Liberia in 1923, saw the rubber in Liberia, brought the Liberian rubber to the US. They tested the Liberian rubber, and they found out that this rubber has actually been part of the rubber coming to Europe. And so it was good. And then they tested the soil. 80% of Liberia's soil is arable, good for agricultural production. Right. And then they saw the political environment. America has significant control over the Liberian economy, the Liberian politics at the time. And in fact, around that same time, the Liberian government had actually applied to America to declare Liberia a protectorate. And this was because the country finances were terrible. The British and the French were still encroaching on Liberia's land from Guinea, Ivory Coast, and from Sierra Leone. So they needed this protection from the US government. So Harvey Firestone found Liberia the most propitious environment to produce rubber for America. And so the negotiation for what is today the Firestone plantation started in 1923, and all of the agreements were signed by the end of 1925 to 1926. 3 agreements were signed. The planting agreement, which created the Firestone Plantations Company, owned by the Firestone Natural Rubber Company in the US. And then they signed a loan agreement of $5 million. and then they signed a put agreement.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. We are in discussion with Dr. Ibrahim Nyei. The topic: for profit, for power, state policies, foreign direct investments, and economic exploitation in Liberia, the period under review, 1920 to 1960. So now you walk us through even what was happening before then. Now we are in the 1920s. We have Firestone. Why do you think this time was a time for exploitation?
So, in the Firestone Agreement, that's when the moment of exploitation began. First of all, the Liberian government was hamstrung in negotiating with Firestone. So there was a debate in the Liberian government. By 1925, when Firestone first went to the country in 1923, the government finances were in serious troubles. There were debt. Government was not paying its salaries. And so at that time, Firestone had significant edge. But by the time to sign the agreement, the finances were in a much better shape. So the finance minister said, we cannot take this loan because Firestone insisted that the government of Liberia take 5 million loan. So it's like you forcing somebody to credit from you.
Yeah.
And so the government of Liberia said, no, we don't want this loan. But then the American government insisted that the government of Liberia must take the loan. Why? Because Firestone wanted to control the politics of the country. Because before that, the British companies that loaned the Liberian government were also in the country, like the Liberia Development Company, were in the country collecting taxes on behalf of the government and building public infrastructure on behalf of the Liberian government and servicing the previous loans. So Firestone wanted to take control of that process. So when the Liberian government actually initially refused to take the loan, the American government compelled the Liberian government to take this loan. And also the exploitation of the natives. The Liberian government promised the indigenous leaders, the chiefs, that Firestone was not going to take native land or what they call tribal reserve.
Right.
And then they only wanted to give Firestone 500,000 acres. And Firestone insisted that they wanted 1 million. And so the government was in a much weaker position in 1923 than 1925, according to the finance minister then. But then they signed the agreement, and then they went down to Magibi, where you call now Magibi, or previously the Gibi and Marshall areas.
Right.
They went now, burned villages, evicted people from their towns, and made the indigenous chiefs force them to accept the concession and displace their farms, and then they established the plantation. So the 2,000 acres that was at Mount Barclay for the Liberian Rubber Company, which liquidated in 1920, went back to the Liberian government control. So Firestone initially paid for that plantation at a much cheaper price to control that plantation, which they used, which was the initial plant, which they continued to use, they developed before starting the main plantation. So part of the agreement also, the Liberian government assured Firestone that they will provide labor for Firestone. And so this labor was, at the end of the day, was what they call the carrot and stick approach. They told Firestone you have to pay the workers. But also, because there was so much workers that refused to go to the plantation, the Liberian government was forced under the agreement to provide workers for Firestone. And so this came the condition of forced labor. How do you mobilize the forced labor for Firestone? So the Liberian government went to the chiefs, instructed the district commissioners in the counties, and the district commissioners instructed the chiefs that you have to recruit laborers. So it was forced labor. They literally recruited men, arrested them from their farm, put them to the plantation. So every chief was entitled to 15 cents per head. So if you recruited 10 men, 15 cents was $1.50. So to get more money, the chiefs were recruiting more men, sending their own people. So from Lofa, if you go to the Magibi area, you see a lot of Fire, Tamba, different people from all parts of the countries. Some of them were recruited, or their grandparents were recruited under conditions of forced labor. And up to the point of 1960, Firestone had 24,000 employees, even though they had promised that they were going to have up to 300,000 employees. And out of that 24,000 employees, 50% were recruited forcibly from the counties.
Where are you getting this information from?
From the archives, the concession agreements, the reports from Sir Harry Johnston himself in 1905. When he visited Liberia, he wrote 2 massive volumes on the Liberian economy and on the fauna and flora. And so when you want to know about the economy of the Liberian state before 1900, or from the period up to 1905, all of the companies that existed there, including pictures. So Sir Harry Johnston have that in his volume written in 1905. And then there was a book written by George Brown in 1941, Economic History of Liberia, written in 1941. So you find so many information on the Liberian economy up to 1941 from that book. And then there are British diplomatic reports in the archives. You know, diplomats always report to their head offices, and then the reports talk about the country's interest. So most of the British diplomatic reports will talk about British companies in Liberia. The American diplomatic reports will talk about American companies in the country to that period. And then there's also a very interesting book, another economic history of Liberia written by Fred van der Kras in 1983. It's called The Open Door Policy, a modern economic history of Liberia. And so there are some archival sources. You go to the British Library, you check the archive on Liberia, you see some very interesting raw handwritten reports from 1800s, some typewritten, and then they have put them in a facsimile because some are already in terrible states. They were about to be destroyed, so they have protected them. So the original Firestone agreement, you find all of these things in the archive.
So anyone listening to this now is like, wow. But so let's take for a minute, leave the 1920s and 1960s and come in the last 20 years. What has changed when it comes to this kind of exploitation, unfair trade agreements, and that kind of strong-handedness?
Well, we still have the model that gave concession companies. You, Mr. Jah, if you purchase 5 used cars in the US, and then you want to start a used car business in Liberia, you pay more taxes than Meter Steel on that, because Meter Steel have duty-free privileges. You don't have duty-free privileges.
No.
Firestone has duty-free privileges. You're a Liberian business, you don't have duty-free privileges. So that has not changed. So the model is still extraction. Meter Steel has is under no obligation to do intermediate processing of the ore they extract from Liberia. Firestone in 1969 was about to establish a rubber manufacturing plant, a tire manufacturing plant in Liberia. But then that plant collapsed for some reasons. And there is no clear explanation on why they diverted and then moved to Ghana trying to investigate the possibilities in Ghana, but that also failed. They promised to provide 300,000 jobs in the first 15 years of the agreement. But by 1960, they only had 24,000 employees. And 50% of them, like I said earlier, were forcibly recruited. And that only stopped because Portugal sued the Liberian government for forced labor. So much hasn't changed in terms of this economic model. So we are still extracting. And every now and then, every Liberian government is talking about diversification into agricultural production, intermediate production, manufacturing. But we are still depending on this because you have to do long-term planning in your economic model to think about the next 30 years. So we have to start thinking about the next 6 years towards election. So if you think strategically in 30 years what you want for your economy, you want to phase out extraction to manufacturing. And then if the companies say no, we don't have the capacity to manufacture, we need electricity, you have to make the plan to provide electricity so that massive industries can have this major good sources of power to produce in the country. But if you're operating 88 megawatts and then the companies have to put their own generators on, that's cost prohibitive. And so you have to transition in tandem with your policies. If you are asking the companies to do intermediary production, you also have to provide the incentives or the propitious environment.
Right.
You have to have good roads. You have to have power. You have to have skilled manpower as well.
Internet as well.
Yeah. Now we have 40% of the reserve forest in the Upper Guinea coast. So we have a very rich forest. And IT is producing furniture for the global economy, but then we are still exporting round log from the country. Why? Why Liberia should still be exporting round log? Since 1953, we started exporting round log when we signed the forestry agreements. Almost 60 years, and we're still exporting raw round log, lumber, timber out of the country. When you should, at this stage, be able to create the condition so that the West Africa, the Gulf of Guinea, rely on you for furniture production.
That brings me to Sethi Brothers when we're talking about, what it's like today, because Sethi Brothers, as I read, was supposed to be manufacturing cement in the country. And that's the agreement they signed, but it turns out they are imported.
Well, we have cement coal, and I think so many other Liberians have made efforts over the last few years to import cement. Some will come to the market, go out, some come back. But we need a grand strategy for the economy.
And the good governance, thinking about that, or it's not part of it?
Yeah, they've been working on something like that on long-term economic planning. They work on the Liberian, the Vision 2023 during Madam Salif's era. The Liberia Rising, which is Vision 2030. Actually, the Governance Commission worked on that. It was from 2012 to 2030 towards a middle-income economy. The target was by 2030, Liberia should be a middle-income economy.
While preparing for this, I was looking at a graph. There was a paper written by, how do you call them? But basically, what that is, we're talking about doing business in Liberia, right? Because all this is to start a business in Liberia. I don't know if we can see that graph clearly, but what it says there is starting a business, and it brings me to the question of the environment, right? Starting a business in Liberia, we are at 75. So you're doing like comparison compared to other countries, what it is like. So they look at indicators like dealing with construction permits, getting electricity, registering property, getting credit, protecting minority investors, paying taxes, trading, enforcing. And it takes so long to start a business. So what I want to say is that the environment is not conducive to doing business.
Yeah, so we talked earlier during the introductory stage of this discussion, we talked about political risk analysis. That report, the doing business report, is globally done by the World Bank. Yeah. And they assess the business environment in every country every year. And the indicators you name are what they assess to inform the world economy as to which countries have made their processes easier to do business. Yeah. I'm sure in the US, you can establish a business perhaps in a day by going online.
Yeah.
And then you get your PIN code for tax payment and so forth. And in the UK, you do the same. But then in Liberia, you have to, if you want to open a construction company, you have to go through several processes, get this permit from this ministry and get this license from here, go to the business registry. So actually, this is something that the Liberian government, sometimes around 2012, they try to work around by reducing the bottlenecks and the red tapes. And so they consolidated everything into one agency called the Liberia Business Registry. And so the business registry should make it at least possible for one to register a business in around 72 hours. And that was the plan. But unfortunately, it's perhaps taking people months.
Right. In 2020, that report says in Liberia ranked 75 when it comes to starting a business. Rwanda is 35. Sierra Leone, 58.
Yeah, so this means if an investor is looking at this report and they are looking for a conducive environment to start a business. And then they're looking at the West African sub-region, and then they turn to the World Business, they're doing business index. They look at the countries by their rank. They say, okay, this country, I think it's quite easier in Sierra Leone than Liberia. So let's start assessing Sierra Leone. What are the steps? What we need to do? So it means Liberia is off the table if you're just looking at this index on the face value. And these reports are what all of the consulting firms that advise businesses, these are the reports they read.
They look at, yeah.
Yeah, these are the reports they look at. They look at the Doing Business report, the Freedom in the World report published by Freedom House, Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, the Ibrahim Annual Governance Report. That's what the risk analysis companies are looking at. They are not going on the ground to do these things and compare countries. No, they go on the ground now to look for the granular, the details of what is involved. But on face value, these are the first things they turn over to inform their strategy as to where they can start their investment or where they can advise their clients to start investment.
And all this boils down to leadership, right? Because we look at the government, you know, we started with CDB King, Edwin Bagley, Todmore, and now we are where we are. What role or what should leaders, president, cabinet, government do to kind of prepare the ground so that first of all, there will be no exploitation of the people, and then we can have this conducive environment for businesses or investors to come in the country and develop the place?
Well, it depends on the economic orientation or the ideological orientation of the leaders in power. And if you have an orientation that subscribes to foreign direct investment or exploitation, and you only want to extract rent to keep yourself in power for the time being in finance campaign, then obviously you're not going to lead any significant change. But if you have long-term thinking and you believe in the socio-economic empowerment of the people and making sure that the people be the owners of economic production, then you begin to generate policies that transfer production to the Liberian people. Perhaps you create the incentive for them. If you want the Liberian people to compete in the economy, you provide the financing, the capital, you provide the capital, you provide the training, and you make it easy for them to do business. You reduce the bottlenecks. So the Liberian government actually did this for foreign companies mainly from the 1920s upward. So what they did was to first ensure that they get access to more land for concession. So they passed several land laws. In 1956, they passed when they signed, after signing the forestry agreement and some mineral agreements, and there were other mineral agreements waiting, they passed the Aborigines Law of 1956 and then the Public Land Law of 1956, which gave the government the upper hand and the authority to take any land in the hinterlands of the country once a tribe or a paramount chief cannot produce deed for that land, even though they've been living on that land for generations. Their ancestors live on that land for generations. The Liberian government passed that land. That land law in 1956, two laws, the Aborigines Law of 1956 and the Public Land Law of 1956, which authorized the president to take any portion of public land for concession and for economic purposes. So companies went there. They signed the agreements with those companies and then just demarcated areas, and then the companies went. So some of the indigenous people, of course, our people accepted, thinking that they would have benefited. Now, we haven't come to the Liberian Mining Company, LMC, which decided over massive exploitation in that country. Yeah. So when they passed that law, so these are the incentives, passing the Public Land Law, which gave the president the right to give public land to companies for investment, and then the Tubman's open door policy. The open door policy, where it was originally, there are debates amongst scholars as to when the open door policy started. It was announced officially open door policy in 1947. But some scholars argue that the open door policy started in 1911 because before 1911, there was a law in Liberia called the Port of Entry Law. Yeah. The Port of Entry Law was passed in 1864. The Liberian government passed the Port of Entry Law in 1864 to restrict to restrict trading to several ports because the Europeans were just docking at so many ports in the country, some controlled by chiefs. They were trading with the chiefs. And so the Liberian government wanted to bring all under government control. So they identified only 6 ports as official port of entry. That was Buchanan, Monrovia, Sino, Maryland, Grand Cape Mount, Robertsport. So those 6 areas were the only areas you were allowed to officially trade with the Liberian government. And so the indigenous resisted, the chiefs resisted, and so that led to several wars in the 1800s. And the Europeans even pushed the indigenous to fight against that because they found it comfortable and easy to do business with the chiefs who didn't care more, who didn't understand much about sovereignty and territorial rights. They only wanted to trade along the coast. So the Liberian government put of entry law, they started patrolling the coast, and any chief that traded with the Europeans, they seized boats, started taking control of tribal areas. So that law was enforced until 1911. But in 1911, the Liberian government declared all ports of entry. And also, it was also because of the crew codes. The crew codes fought the Liberian government up to 1932. So they had to pacify the crew codes to allow the crew to continue to trade on their ports. So the port of entry law was an incentive to allow Europeans to dock in the country. So that was an open door policy, according to some scholars. You can accept that as they opened the door for foreign investment. Tubman declared another one, 1947. At that time, he had already signed the LMC contract. And when they understood the value of the ore, and then LAMCO came in, National Iron Ore Mining Company came in, and then now, from the 1960s, all of the mineral agreement, the Liberian government have 50% share in them. But before that, LMC had exploited significantly. So you have to provide similar incentives if you want to change the strategy, the mode of production. Provide incentives that will deliberately target the indigenous population or the Liberian citizens. Target them deliberately, empower them to trade in the economy, and then they take control.
Yeah. And before we come to LMC, one last question on first I said what the government can do, right? So what the citizens can do, what can be our role as citizens?
Well, the citizens have to first be law-abiding. That's the responsibility. You have rights and you have responsibility. Your rights is to have access to justice. You must be treated fairly under the rule of law. You must have access to services, and you must have access to public protection. So if you give the sovereignty to the state, it's the responsibility of the state to provide protection to the citizens. So you have that right, and then you have responsibility. That responsibility is to participate as a member of the civic community, to engage in public affairs. You have to vote. You have to demand accountability from the government. And you are a consumer. And so you can also continue to be a consumer. You have to be a producer. So in order to purchase consumables, you must participate in the economy to earn an income. So that participation could be obtaining a job with a company, establishing a company, or obtaining a job with the government. So, or establishing a company is self-employment. So the main citizen can participate in the economy. How to work for a company, you must gain the requisite skill. If you want to work for government, you gain the requisite skills. And you want to start your own business, you identify the sector you want to work in. If you want to be a miner, you learn, get the career in that sector. If you want to tap palm wine or you want to tap rubber, you get a career in that sector and hold on to that career. And then when the economy is changing, what you do, you change along with the economy. So when you find out that your career is no longer useful to the modern economy, the demands of the modern economy, you find skills in that economy, how you fit. And if your career can still be useful, but it needs to be updated, you update your career. So in the Western world, you find out that every 3-4 years, companies are asking people to take certain training, go for certain tests. It's because they want to update them, make them prepare for the new demands and challenges of the workplace. So that's what that's what citizens have to do, while at the same time demanding support from the government to participate in the economy.
This is focused on Liberia. Our discussion is with Dr. Ibrahim Nyei. We are discussing for profits and for power, state policies, FDIs, and economic exploitation in Liberia. The period we are zooming in on is 1920 to 1960. Let's go to LMC and this whole mining thing. I was in Yokepa area there. I saw Mount Fegi. I crossed over to Guinea. I saw Togadi and whole lot of miners, Putu Mountains, all over the place.
So if any company already exploited Liberia, besides Firestone, will be the LMC. In 1927, between 1926 and 1927, Sierra Leone did a geological survey. And the geological survey in Sierra Leone identified iron ore, diamond, and gold in the Sierra Leone area. In 1930, Sierra Leone signed an iron ore agreement with a company called Delco, DELCO, Sierra Leone Development Company. It was a British company. They signed that agreement with them in 1930. And then in 1934, Sierra Leone signed another agreement with a company called the Consolidated, or CAST, Consolidated African Selection Trust. And that selection trust, Sierra Leone gave them a monopoly and a monopoly on all diamonds in Sierra Leone in 1934. So this CAST was a British company based in South Africa, operating in Botswana, exploiting diamond mines. And DBS, which is one of the world's leading diamond miners, had significant share in CAST. So CAST got this contract in Sierra Leone in 1934 to mine diamond in the country. And because of the findings of the geological survey in Sierra Leone in 1927, which led to this development, so the European companies saw Liberia. They said, well, Delco is in Sierra Leone. They have huge iron ore deposit, a near monopoly over the iron ore. And Liberia is right close to Sierra Leone. So possibly, if we check to Liberia, we'll be able to find iron ore in Liberia, because they are only divided by colonial boundaries. So it could be the same land space. So this Dutch company, knowing that there was diamond in Sierra Leone and massive iron ore in Sierra Leone, they said, okay, since we cannot invest here, let's check to Liberia. And so they went. The company was called the Holland Syndicate. So they signed a concession agreement for the entire western area. And that the area they targeted was the area bordering Sierra Leone. And you know, the western areas of Liberia, Grand Cape Mount County, Bomi County at that time, the western province, border Sierra Leone, right?
Right.
They wanted land right close to Sierra Leone to be able to do their investigation and see if they will find the same minerals in Liberia.
They wanted to spy.
Yeah, so their geological survey actually focused on, they wanted to check for diamond.
Yeah.
But then they found iron ore. But they were even convinced of the quality of the iron ore in 1931. So they lost interest in the investment. And then they closed the investment. Around 1935, they stopped the surveying. They surveyed the entire other parts of the country. They even identified the Bond Range. They actually did. But they didn't find diamond, and they were not satisfied with the quality of the ore. So perhaps they didn't check much. So by 1935, they lost interest. So with the boom in mining in Sierra Leone, the Liberian government too invited the Americans to do a geological survey in Liberia in the early 1940s. And so the Americans did a detailed survey. And so by this time, by the 1940s, Liberians were already crossing over to Sierra Leone to work on the mines for Delco and for the Sierra Leone Selection Trust. And so most of them were also smuggling diamonds for the Sierra Leone Selection Trust. A good number of diamonds were being smuggled, and they were coming through Liberia because the Sierra Leone government had one law: only the Sierra Leone Selection Trust was allowed to export diamond out of the country. So smaller miners were mining the country, and then they were mostly transiting through Liberia and exporting from Liberia to the European market. So then the Liberian government invited the US government to do an extensive geological survey. And this geological survey found a significant ore of significant commercial quantity in the western area, closer to Sierra Leone, in the Bong area, and in Nimba. And immediately after this American survey, there was a retired American Army officer called Lansdale Christie, who was a friend to President Tubman. He fought in the World War II. And so he came to President Tubman and told President Tubman that the report from the survey is very interesting, and I'm interested in setting up a company to mine this ore. And so that's how he established the LMC with some other European investors. He was the founder, but he had 9% share. And there was a company called the Bethlehem Steel that had the highest up to more than 50% of the share. And then the rest of the shares went to private individuals. And so the LMC, he created this LMC. When they were signing the contract, due to the incentives given the LMC, the cabinet disagreed with President Tubman. He said, no, we cannot give this company this much. The cabinet disagreed, and there were some judges that disagreed, and there were some journalists that wrote against the contract. And the journalists that wrote against this contract went to prison. The judges were dismissed, and then Tubman forced his cabinet to accept. He forced the cabinet to accept this contract. They accepted this contract. So the LMC, they started exporting ore they started in 1945. By 1961, they were exporting ore. By the time, by 1951, 6 years later, they were exporting ore. By the time we were to 1960, their profit alone was far more than the Liberian government revenue. And so I think I have a table here to just tell you the huge profit the LMC made in Liberia. Just in the first few years of production. After 3 years of production, 1951, 52, 53, the LMC had a profit of, their initial investment was actually 10 million. But just the profit from the first 3 years of production was 11 million. That was far more than the initial investment. Wow. So their capital, the profit was now even more than the capital. And so moving on, by the 1960s, they were earning more in profit than the Liberian government was earning in total revenue generated from the LMC, the Firestone, and the taxes they collected from the people. So what did LMC do? LMC extracted Bomi County, where they have the Bomi Hills, and they paid very less to the Liberian government in taxes, and they even refused. When the Liberian government signed the LMC contract, at that time there was no income tax. So when they introduced income tax in 1951, the LMC didn't want to accept income tax, saying that it wasn't part of their contract. But then they had to renegotiate for them to accept the income tax. So that's the extent of profitability they had. And they paid the workers very low wages, and they did not do any significant social development in Liberia except the road they paved to Bomi County. And by the time in 1977 the LMC closed, that road had not been paved. Okay, they built the iron ore, the train track to export the iron ore transport the iron ore from their mines to the port, and that was it. So when they closed down in 1977, what they left in Bomi is a massive pit. So the Liberian government enjoyed having these companies because they were able to extract revenue, which gave them the upper hand over the indigenous people. And so by having this revenue, President Tubman was able to dismantle all other avenues of accountability by creating avenue for the extraction of these resources. So President Tubman situated himself over the country. And so the judiciary, the legislature, the executive came under full presidential control. And so the companies enjoyed that because they had complete protection from the presidency. So the LMC also, they didn't only sign the Bomi Hills contract, they also had control over the Mano River. So moving forward in the 1960s, when they were about to sign to develop the Mano River agreement, the Liberian government said this time around, we need a share in this company because the LMC was extracting so much, and the Liberian government was seeing this. So in the Mano River mine, when they established the National Iron Ore Mining Company, it's the same LMC that created the NIOC. Wow. So the Liberian government has 50% share in the NIOC of the profit. But who mine the NIOC? The LMC created smaller companies to manage the operations. So that was the situation around the creation of LMC.
Well, and I wonder who will make sure that that 50% is actually 50% coming to the government.
Well, yeah, that's it. And the economy grew, and whether the government had the capacity at the time, but few individuals benefited, and there was not much accountability. For example, we didn't plan to talk about this. The bond mining company.
Yeah.
The bond mining company, when that concession agreement was signed, the Liberian government had a share in that agreement. But then at the time, it was the German mining company. By the time the BNC, when it became the bond mining company, the Liberian government sold its share. But up to today, you hardly find records as to what happened to the Liberian government share in that company. So there was no public record of it, of the Liberian government share in that company that was sold to private owners.
Oh.
And it happened during President Tubman's era.
Yeah. I'm speechless. So, again, I come to the same question. During the presidency of Madame Salif, we saw a lot of these concession agreements. How were they similar or different from what you just spoke about?
Well, I said earlier that they just followed the same model. They wanted investors to come to the country. There's this economic, this neoliberal theory called trickle-down economic theory, or the trickle-down effect. You allow a big company to establish in the country and hire a few people, pay them, and these people will hire other people to work in their homes, and then the money will flow down from the investor to the workers and from the workers to the families. And that hasn't worked in the Liberian case.
Yeah.
You have to change that model where you think by doing only extraction, the workers at the companies will be paid, and then they will be able to establish small businesses, or their family will have money to create, to do more transaction and make the economy vibrant. It hasn't worked in the Liberian case. The trickle-down economic policy, or the theory, hasn't been proven significantly in Liberia, and not even in other countries where they have argued for its implementation, like South Africa. The trickle-down economic theory hasn't been, it hasn't proven itself to be a progressive means of economic production. And so what you need to do, again, we come back to this, is to put the people in charge of production.
Right.
When you put the people when we argue this, people say we are communists. But if by arguing for people to control their own resources and generate income is communism, then I'm proud and happy to be a communist.
And that was the question I was coming to, is like, what is that one thing that needs to change?
That one thing that needs to change is public accountability. You have to create institutions for public accountability.
How does that come about? You know,
the political parties, the main institutions of public accountability in every government are the political parties. The government is created. There are two branches. For the legislature to demand accountability from the executive, the legislature needs to have opposition.
Yeah.
But if the opposition members elected to the legislature will side with the ruling party, then you have effectively dismantled the institutions of public accountability, or you have hamstrung the legislature. So in the case of Liberia, you need active and well-organized political parties to make the other branches of government function. They exist, but because the political parties are technically in bed with the ruling parties, they are not competitors. They are not fruitful competitors. They only contest election, and after the election, they don't compete on policies, and they don't compete on ideological orientation or direction of the country. They don't have contestation over that. They only compete over vote. And so every government that comes to power is just to fight to win the vote, not to fight to establish a system. In America, when the Republicans take over, they bring policies that are conservative,
right,
that are driven by their values they believe in. When the Democrats take over, they do the same. In Britain, when the Labour Party take over, they introduce socialist policies, liberal policies. When the Conservative Party takes over, They introduce policies that represent the values they stand for. In Liberia, when a political party wins the election, what they're going to do is to fight to win the next election. Whether they change the system to reflect a particular value point or to reflect a vision, we've not seen that. All of the directions have been how to win the next election. And if your focus is to win the next election, you will continue to implement short-term strategy, put money in the bag, go from one county to another, share it, come back to Monrovia, and then you say, oh yeah, you are succeeding, you are popular, and then the people vote for you. Yes, they vote for you the next election. But are you changing are you changing anything fundamentally? And this is my argument with the political parties that are in the opposition. What different are they bringing to the table? Besides saying the CDC government is corrupt, and besides saying the CDC government is incompetent, what different are they bringing to the table? So by you just saying the CDC government is corrupt or incompetent is not a policy. We need a policy. You have to share a policy with the people. So if you argue that the CDC government is corrupt and they need to be changed, then you don't have a policy. You need something. You need to show us that when you take over, you're going to produce a Liberian-led economy, an economy led by Liberians. How you intend to do this? It has to be a strategy different from what the CDC is doing. Are you still going to be signing concession agreements with foreign investors, giving them tax credit and allowing them to exploit labor? Then if you're going to do the same, then it's better off we keep with the CDC. Exactly. Or we keep with the Unity Party. So what they need to do is a new direction. And that new direction is to do it differently. Are you going to have a country that is producing accountants at every state-run university? More accountants are produced than doctors. More accountants are produced than engineers. More accountants are produced at all of the universities than teachers. But then you still sit and allow foreigners serve as accountants in the same country. So what different are you doing? So we need a policy from the opposition. And we need that policy we are talking about is a policy that doesn't tell us that the CDC government is corrupt or the CDC government is incompetent. It's a policy that tells us when we take over, this is the direction we are taking. And this is different and more productive and progressive than this direction the CDC government is taking.
I don't know if I should say amen to that if I were in church. But that earns you a ticket to Tough Talking Thursday. We want to bring you back here so that we can talk about that. I don't want to put too much politics into this, but this is the issue because we are not discussing politics. But let me bring in few of the comments from our viewers. They are here. They are commenting. We got more comments here. So let's start with Kafuma Soare. Why is it that Liberia still remains a rentier state? No significant shift from the natural resources exploitation to industrialization, 1920s to present. I think we kind of hammered that very well during the. But respond to that before I move on.
Well, I mean, let's break it down so that others that are hearing us. Rentier state is a regime system where the state relies only on extraction. So they say rentier meaning the state relies. The source of the state revenue and perhaps its authority is on the rent the companies pay. So, and any state that relies on rent from foreign companies, and you don't move towards production or towards more taxation and manufacturing, it's difficult to develop economically. And so our reliance on rentier state is because of the myopism in our political system, short-termism. You know, we have short-term visions. Our visions are not wide enough, the length and breadth of our vision is so myopic in scope. So that's why we continue to rely on rent. And how to move from rentier state to a more progressive economic state is to introduce other systems of production. You want to start manufacturing, you want to compel the companies, not just compel, but also provide the incentives and the condition for the companies to move into different layers of production. So those that are tapping the rubber, you just want them to export latex, the raw rubber? No. You ask them, look, at this stage, if you have 2,000 tappers that are tapping the rubber, you move to manufacturing. At that manufacturing stage, you perhaps need another 1,000. And that 1,000 robot at that manufacturing stage will pay taxes to government, income tax. And when you produce that robot from the tapping, from the production of latex to that intermediate stage, there are other group of workers. And then before it gets to the market, there are other people waiting for distribution.
Right.
When the economy, the value chain increases, there are people waiting for distribution, and there are people waiting at the tail end, the retail end. They sell in the market. And so many people on that value chain will be economically empowered. They will have jobs to do, and they have businesses. And then we're talking about round logs, man. If you just look at the round log, the potential we have to produce furniture in that country, like some countries have already begun to think about banning the exportation of round logs. Yeah. So what it does is that the companies that are interested will come and investigate the potential, the round log potential, the furniture potential in the sub-region. And then they say, okay, since the government is asking us that we cannot export round logs, we can establish the factories.
Right.
Then we establish the factories. When the companies are producing chairs in that country, children in Grand Cook County will sit on blocks.
Right. No, say Tottenham High. Yeah. The president went to Tottenham and was shocked that there are no benches.
You have 40% of all the forests in the Upper Guinea coast, fresh reserve and very productive forest. And children in the country sitting on blocks to hear their notes. You shouldn't do that. So you have to migrate from that rentier state to a more progressive and productive economy that focuses on manufacturing, agricultural production.
And that's why in Liberia, then you hear Sao. Sadia Massacre Bangura say a book entitled Liberia Rediscovered tells the Firestone story. Fidel T. Booty, that's Fidel Castro T. Booty.
Fidel, okay.
Yeah, he said the Stevenson plan, so interesting. Yeah. Fidel has been checking on this show. He's been kind of waiting for it, being thirsty. So Fidel, thanks for joining. So said, don't forget the British loan, which was contracted by E.J. Royal government.
Yeah, that was in the 1870s. 1870, actually, loan took that loan in 1870. Everyone knows, it's a general understanding, Liberian history. We read that the Royal government failed because he corrupted the loan.
Yeah.
And so actually, I'm very happy that Ente Sedia is here. And that loan, from the taking of that loan up to the 1900 and up to 1920, the Liberian government finances fluctuated from one loan to another, And so they signed this contract with Sir Harry Johnston, this British colonialist who retired and went to Liberia to do business. And then he was managing the government finances.
Somebody trying to be funny here, say you have a Chinese name.
Nyei.
He said this other Chinese man can speak good Liberian English. Yeah, real Chinese name. Jackie says, so they ended slavery in the U.S. and transported it to Firestone, and yet some tout this special relationship. A few days ago, we're talking about this based on the statement from Chris Smith, Representative Chris Smith, been talking about who in his first statement talked about this special relationship between Liberia and America. So I think that's what Jackie is making reference to.
Yeah, Jackie. Hi, Jackie. Okay, really. Thank you, Jackie. Actually, it's interesting. It's not only the U.S. that stopped slavery and then went to Liberia and then forced the Liberian government to recruit laborers by force to work on Firestone plantation. But if you look at the trend, even in the European colonies, when Britain abolished slavery in 1807, what it did following slavery, they started to establish colonies. So immediately upon the abolition of slavery, 1808, the following year, they established Sierra Leone. They established Sierra Leone as a colony, a British colony in West Africa, which was the center, the capital city of British West Africa. It was Sierra Leone. And then they went to Lagos in 1861, declared colonial rule over Lagos. after defeating or fighting one chief. And then they gradually established protectorate rule over other parts of Nigeria. Went to Southern Africa in the 1880s, immediately after the partitioning of Africa, took over Botswana. Some of their investors went and took over South Africa. So they followed the Africans, established plantations, and established mines in the African colonies, and then extracted the resources instead of bringing the slaves. Also, they wanted to provide a condition for the African chiefs and the nobles, those that were considered the nobilities in African communities, to stop the slave trade so that they could go into what they call legitimate trade. So this legitimate trade was to allow them to do forced labor. And by allowing them, so the British also accepted domestic slavery. So what they stopped was the exploitation of slaves to Europe. But they allowed domestic slavery in most of their African colonies until 1924. They abolished domestic slavery because what the chiefs told them and the nobles told them, the African nobles, was, look, we stop the the exploitation of slaves. But our plantations, our natural forests, the extraction of resources, we have to rely on our domestic workers or their slaves. So the British have to accept that. But then by 1924, they said no. The British agreed that they're going to end domestic slavery in all of their colonies. So Jackie is right. We can put, if she wants to say so, that Firestone, like the British did, follow the Africans and went to Liberia and established Firestone and had like a labor force on the plantation that was in a enslaved condition. They were enslaved, but they refused. Liberia reached out to the Americans several times to stop the incursion on Liberian territories. Actually, in 1876, the territories Liberia claimed, I said this in my previous lecture at Indiana University, in 1876, the territories the Liberian government claimed stretched from about 650 miles along the coast and up to the Niger River northward. So that was a massive territory claimed by the Liberian state. Whether they had effective control in those areas, it was totally different thing. But on many occasions, they called on the American government to at least establish protectorate rules over those areas to stop the French and the British from encroaching on those territories. The American government refused. And
those are our friends.
The Spanish made a proposal to take over Liberia. The Americans refused. The Germans made proposals. The Americans refused, but they didn't help the country to protect its territory. Most of the districts in Kailahun, the areas today Kailahun district, Liberia lost that territory just recently, 1911, if I may say. Because 1911, you expected the state to be well consolidated, but Liberia lost that.
Kailahun in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, and under the Berlin Conference, when they met in Berlin to partition Africa, where no African leaders sat, they had a clause in Article 35, which they said effective occupation. For any European power to claim any portion of an African state, you must be effectively occupying that state. So effective occupation means either your navy is along the coast, or you have your flag planted, and you have one or two colonial officers there. So Liberia, all of the territories they were claiming, they had no control. They had no flag planted. They only had negotiation with the chiefs, signed treaties with the chiefs. And so the British took those areas from the Kavala River all the way to San Pedro.
Yeah,
it's part of the Liberian territories, but the French took it from the Liberian state. And a small settler state, weak as compared to the military might of a European power. It was insignificant to challenge the European powers at the time.
Sure. My currency as a great brother with huge wealth of knowledge. Fidel again say, I disagree with the premise. All foreign companies follow a clear logic. Africa is for exploitation of raw materials and market for expensive finished product. Prof. Kinhindi Andrews of Birmingham City University covered this in his new book, The New Age of Empire. He continues, that is a romantic view. I don't know which view. There are many examples of African leaders trying to upset the global research system of economies. Western power undermine any leader with such dreams. Well, Fidel, we still got to work. Fidel City Booty, and you believe that our raw material will always, that mean in your mind, nothing will change.
Actually, Fidel has some point, because most of these arguments about economic productions are still under debate and constructive debate based on the position you stand from. Yes, seriously, so many African leaders fought colonial powers. In Nigeria, for example, most of the chiefs fought wars against the colonial powers. And the territory is now called the Niger Delta. There was a European company called the Royal Niger Company that controlled that area. The Royal Niger Company ruled that area alongside the British government, while the British government ruled the area called Lagos. Another British company ruled the central portion of Nigeria, and then the British government established a protectorate in the southern part of Nigeria. So the area called the Royal Niger Company that was ruled by the British, they fought, this British company and the chiefs in that area fought for many years over control of the economy. But then the chiefs were overpowered, because what they did also among themselves, like states do fight. So the chiefs had wars among themselves, fighting over territory, fighting for commerce. America, China, they all at war. Sometimes there's a trade war, and sometimes there are nuclear threats. So the chiefs were fighting as well. But then the British went and intervened in those areas. The colonial powers went and intervened in those areas under the terminology of pacification, that they were pacifying the hinterlands to stop the chiefs from fighting against each other. So what some of the chiefs did was to accept British control or colonial control to have more power to fight others. And so actually there's an interesting case which someone needs to investigate. When I'm just buttressing Fidel's point that some of the chiefs resisted colonial rule. When one of the Nigerian Obas at that time in 1870 fought this Royal Niger Company in one of their stations. When they overtook this station, they actually they killed 24 Liberians at that station and arrested 60 Liberians that had moved from Liberia, mainly crew people that were working on ships, because most of them worked, and that's how they actually called them crew, because they were crewmen on the ship, CREW. So they actually killed 24 Liberians, arrested 60, and took the 60 to their towns. And a Nigerian historian called Mark Shiolon just recently published a book called What Britain Did to Nigeria. This book was just published last month, actually, and is now on the market for sale. And so I came across this story about the crewmen that died in that particular, in that Nigerian war, in the indigenous resistance. Then there was also the famous professor who wrote about most Liberian indigenous groups, Warren Daziveru. He wrote two important papers in 1969 in the Liberian Studies Journal, Tribal Reaction to Nationalism. And he talked about the various struggle of the indigenous chiefs against these colonial powers, or even the Liberian settler state. And also Robert Capel, he wrote a book, he wrote an article called Liberian Resistance to the American Liberian State, Indigenous Resistance. So Fidel is actually right, but they were overpowered, and a good number of them had to accept the largesse and the incentives that came with siding with European powers. If you are a weaker chief, and then you have another neighboring chief who is stronger, and then you side with the European powers to support you, to colonize to defeat the other area, conquer them, and then they install you as the paramount chief. And so from that moment, your authority now comes from the European colonial powers, no longer from the people.
Sure. Let's run through a few comments so we can be drawing down the curtains. Definitely, we want to have you back. Josh H.W. Patel said, very informed guest. His presentation got me thinking the terrible state of affairs in Liberia, mainly due to two reasons. One, bad practice on the part of direct foreign investors, and two, successive Liberian government policies. One wonders if our would-be traditional partners ever wanted us to grow and prosper as a nation. To my mind, the absence of manufacturing industries appears to be deliberate plan of conspiracy and with the sole intent of perpetual exploitation. That's my man George But Kafuma Suarez said the one thing that needs to change is to come out with a new model. The existing model is not providing any positive dividends. Talking about political parties, Jackie Saya said no party has a strategy to strengthen our institutions. Power equals accumulation, no matter which party. And David Gosso, no policy will work because Liberians are lazy. I don't think. I don't think. How long will we sit and allow our ocean, our mines, our businesses, etc., to be dominated by foreigners? There's some disagreement here. And then the last comment, I have many more, but let me stop here. Dennis Kake, we have 7 of the world's natural resources, but still rank high amongst the world's poorest nations. What can you suggest we do to get back to the status when we competed, maybe competed with Germany in 1960? Is there a possibility?
Well, we have to clarify this myth that we competed with Germany in 1960s. We didn't. We didn't compete with Germany. What we had was an economic growth rating. Like every year, they say the economy grew by 5%, 10%. So there was this year when the Liberian economy grew similar to the growth in the German economy, but it was not the same size. For example, you are at work, and then you are earning 2,000 per month, and then they increase your salary by 10%, right. And then somebody is making $1 million, they increase the person's salary by 7%. Are you still very far away from this person?
Yeah.
So we didn't compete with Germany. We only have a rate of growth. So every year, every government, the Statistics Bureau, measure the level of economic production. If this year the GDP or the total sum of economic activity in the country was 1 million, and then they check the following year is 1,100,000, so it means the economy grew by 10%.
Yeah.
So it was just in the 1960s for many years, around in the years in the 1960s, we were growing at similar rate with Germany and Japan, but we were not competing with them. We didn't have the capacity. But equally so, while growing, the growth was not translating into development.
Right.
I told you the LMC left Bonny County in tatters, and Firestone is still the way it is. It took only Madame Celine for them to build decent houses for the workers from 1926. The workers were sleeping in something that you could compare to prisons or chicken huts. If you went to Firestone anytime before 2008, you saw what the workers were sleeping in, the housing unit. I mean, they were very terrible housing units. And then compare that when you go to the up the hill, the Sugar Hill area of Habel, you see where the expats live. So that was a myth. We didn't compete economically. The growth, in fact, in 1966, Northwestern University wrote an entire book, a report on the economy of Liberia called Growth Without Development. While we were producing, exporting more, the growth did not translate to any significant change in the living conditions of the people.
Yeah.
The bulk of the rural areas had no schools, had no running water, had no functioning hospitals. So the majority of the population had no access to basic services. So there was no economic development to move in tandem with the growth. And so we didn't compete with Germany. We only have a rate of growth.
Yeah,
and
similar.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm in Monrovia College, I make 60, then I improve to 70, I guess I'm making 70 now. The other guy is in Tottenham High, he was making 80, he got 10 points to 90. I still see students, we're not equal, right?
But we're not competing. we didn't compete. But I have a friend called Samuel Gito. He's now at the University of Liberia. He's having a challenge to this growth without development theory. This book was written in 1966, this report, but he's now challenging it. He just completed his PhD last year as well. So he's now challenging that argument. And mainly, he's a Tubmanist. He's studying the policies of President William V.S. Tubman. So he has some argument to defend Tubman's policies.
Right.
So
and we have
you can reach out to Samuel.
Yeah, we had a show schedule, but at that time, because he wrote the first part of the paper where he's kind of literally carrying Tottenham on his shoulders.
Yeah.
So we plan to have that discussion, but he went to Liberia at that time. So when he gets situated at the university there, we definitely want to have that discussion.
He's challenging some of these arguments, some of the arguments in the Growth Without Development book. And interestingly, the guys, they were very right. Firestone themselves wrote in 1956, the company wrote in 1956 that their venture in Liberia was profitable than any other venture around the world, around all of their other ventures. That includes even their American venture.
In Ohio.
It's in 1956. And so what was happening to the Liberian people? What was happening to the Liberian government with all these profits? So besides the government accumulating power to control the resources, the people benefited nothing, or the state benefited nothing. So it was only the politicians that benefited.
Thank you so much, IB, for the time. Definitely, we want to have you back. I don't think it's if, it's just a matter of when. I want to conclude that way.
We'll see what time I have.
All right. So let me get your parting comment. I want to thank our viewers, and we couldn't read all the comments. And let me read this last one from Bella Peking. Every time the president of Liberia is any project, is only Lebanese you can see showing the president around. Sad. But anyway, let's get your parting comment. Thank you again for coming.
Okay, we focus more on the past. We talk about Firestone, we talk about Liberian Mining Company, and then we talk about the companies before them. So what's about the future? So moving towards the future, again, I see everyone focusing on moving from the rentier state to a more progressive and developmental state, and people talking about what can be done to empower Liberians. So what we need is, I don't have prescriptions. I'm not able to prescribe, but I think we can bounce off ideas with each other. And what we can say is to think more progressively about our country, to engage more and demand more accountability from our government, and to have visions, have greater visions for the future of our country. At this stage, the world is moving more towards a digital economy, and we should move in cadence with this development. And so many other countries are now trying to protect. In the European countries, they have common agricultural policy, their CAP policies, they subsidize their farmers, their local farmers, to produce food for the market and to be able to export. So we need to do same to produce, to help our local producers so that they are able to produce beyond subsistence level, and so that they can trade internally and they can even export. So our economic thinking now must be, everyone talking about the agricultural sector. The ACS, the American Colonization Society, that was their initial plan. They wanted agrarian economy, agricultural sector. So we're still talking about this agricultural sector. Perhaps our future and our potential in transforming our economies in this sector. So without me prescribing, I can just humbly say we need to look more into this, and we need to talk more to each other about what we can contribute and about how we can demand more accountability and producing governments that are accountable to our country, that respect the rule of law, and that respect the common national pot that we all hold onto. Every government must respect our right to our share in that pot and protect it and value it, and so that the natural resources are beneficiated to the benefit. There are two words I'm using. The natural resources are beneficiated to the benefit of every Liberian, and not just those in power. So this is important for the future.
Thank you so much. Join us here on Wednesday, where we're going to be discussing the Poro and the Sunday societies. Our guest, Dr. George H.W. Patel, he's a graduate of the Poro, and Jason Carr, he's a PhD student. He's doing his research on the Poro, the Sunday, and the Bundu. So please join us Wednesday at 7 o'clock as we go into this. Again, we can't thank you enough, Dr. Yen, for joining us here. I want to thank all our viewers and even those who are going to watch later on. Here at Focus on Liberia, we educate, we elevate, and promote all things Liberia. Until then, from me to you, we say good night, and we don't leave without playing our theme song that says, whether you come from Bombing or Sino, you come from Lofa or Nimba, we are all Liberians, and we must do everything we can so that we can have that glorious land of liberty we all desire. Good night.
We are Liberia. Liberia is our home. Liberia people. Liberia.